Greetings, traveller of time. Our quiet tale begins in the rural heart of 14th century France, where the air is thick with the scent of wet earth and peat smoke, and the shadow of the Black Mountains stretches across fields of freshly harvested wheat. Here speaks an old historian who keeps the secrets of the Middle Ages. If you relax or drift to sleep, I'll have fulfilled my task. But first tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Now slowly close your eyes, for I invite your mind to wander away, to an age when candlelight was the only promise that darkness would not last forever, and when faith was tested by an unseen shadow more relentless than any army. Let your breathing fall into rhythm with the slow pace of this tale, where time takes no notice of itself, and every detail exists only to cradle your sleep, not disturb it. Picture yourself not as a spectator, but as a soft breeze moving over thatched rooftops and muddy streets in a small village called Saint-Ours, nestled beneath a pale autumn sky that seems to promise cold rather than warmth. The oak leaves, copper-rusted and weary, barely dare to fall upon the damp ground, waiting for a wind that hasn't yet arrived. The stillness is a sound in itself, deeper than usual, as if the world were holding its breath. In the grey stone monastery that dominates the landscape, a young novice named Elias sat in the library, lit by the faint twilight filtering through narrow windows built to keep both noise and warmth outside. The cold skin of the parchment beneath his fingers was the only chill he allowed himself to feel, a small contrast to the silent unease that hung in the abbey's air like suspended dust. Can you almost sense the roughness of that ancient paper, the scent of mold and beeswax mingling with forgotten incense? It's the smell of centuries, of locked wisdom and unrevealed secrets. Elias was lost in an illuminated manuscript, seeking comfort in sacred words, while the bell tower had remained silent for 3 days, a silence far more haunting than the funeral tolls that came before. In ordinary times, the medieval day was shaped by the steady rhythm of bells, marking the canonical hours: matins at dawn, lauds, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline at nightfall, each with its melody and purpose. But now there was only a void. There was something far more frightening in that silence, something the elder monks refused to speak of, a mystery that the very stillness of life seemed desperate to conceal. Greetings, traveller of time. Our quiet tale begins in the rural heart of 14th century France, where the air is thick with the scent of wet earth and peat smoke, and the shadow of the Black Mountains stretches across fields of freshly harvested wheat. Here speaks an old historian who keeps the secrets of the Middle Ages. If you relax or drift to sleep, I'll have fulfilled my task. But first tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Now slowly close your eyes, for I invite your mind to wander away, to an age when candlelight was the only promise that darkness would not last forever, and when faith was tested by an unseen shadow more relentless than any army. Let your breathing fall into rhythm with the slow pace of this tale, where time takes no notice of itself, and every detail exists only to cradle your sleep, not disturb it. Picture yourself not as a spectator, but as a soft breeze moving over thatched rooftops and muddy streets in a small village called Saint-Ours, nestled beneath a pale autumn sky that seems to promise cold rather than warmth. The oak leaves, copper-rusted and weary, barely dare to fall upon the damp ground, waiting for a wind that hasn't yet arrived. The stillness is a sound in itself, deeper than usual, as if the world were holding its breath. In the grey stone monastery that dominates the landscape, a young novice named Elias sat in the library, lit by the faint twilight filtering through narrow windows built to keep both noise and warmth outside. The cold skin of the parchment beneath his fingers was the only chill he allowed himself to feel, a small contrast to the silent unease that hung in the abbey's air like suspended dust. Can you almost sense the roughness of that ancient paper, the scent of mold and beeswax mingling with forgotten incense? It's the smell of centuries, of locked wisdom and unrevealed secrets. Elias was lost in an illuminated manuscript, seeking comfort in sacred words, while the bell tower had remained silent for 3 days, a silence far more haunting than the funeral tolls that came before. In ordinary times, the medieval day was shaped by the steady rhythm of bells, marking the canonical hours. Matins at dawn, lauds, terce, sext, none, vespers and compline at nightfall, each with its melody and purpose. But now there was only a void. There was something far more frightening in that silence, something the elder monks refused to speak of, a mystery that the very stillness of life seemed desperate to conceal. The novice took a deep breath, drawing into his lungs the cold night air that carried the scent of wet stone and the promise of morning dew, a scent that was, in itself, a small comfort, and a reminder that nature continued its cycle, indifferent to human pain. He knew he had to descend to the village, that he couldn't remain forever behind the stone walls, no matter how strongly the abbot had ordered that no one leave and no one enter, a desperate attempt to preserve the knowledge and faith within the abbey, the last island of order in a sea of chaos. His secret mission, one he had vowed to himself, was to find the orphaned boy of a miller's family he once knew, a child named Thomas, who used to bring flour to the monastery, his face always dusted white and his wide eyes filled with curiosity. Thomas, now alone, infected and abandoned in his small hut of mud and wood, waited for fate to find him. The thought of that little soul, left to face fear and sickness without a single kind hand, was a pain Elias could no longer bear, a wound in his very vocation as a monk. He wrapped himself in a thicker wool cloak, feeling the weight and roughness of the fabric against his thin body, and took the oil lantern that hung from the wall, its flickering flame trembling like an anxious heart. The warmth of that small light in his hands brought momentary relief from the chill of the night air, but it also carried danger, for in those times of darkness, light was an unwanted invitation, a signal to any who still roamed the night, perhaps the looters said to be taking advantage of the chaos to rob the forsaken. Have you ever noticed how a single small flame, in absolute darkness, can cast enormous, twisted shadows, turning the simplest of objects into fleeting monsters? Elias's lantern projected his long shadow onto the stone wall of the corridor, making him look like a trembling giant, a ghost of himself, as he walked hesitantly toward the main gate. The silence of the night amplified the faint creak of his footsteps on the wooden boards, every sound lingering too long, as if the monastery's very architecture conspired to betray his secret. Passing through the chapel, he caught the strong, lingering scent of old incense, mixed with the cold wax of extinguished candles, an atmosphere of reverence and desolation. He paused for a moment, gazing at the rough wooden figure of Christ on the cross, and his mind wandered to the irony of the age he lived in, a society saturated with faith, where every action, every day was dictated by the church's calendar, and yet the punishment that fell upon them seemed the cruelest of all. The Black Death was not merely a disease, it was a crisis of faith, a final test of belief in a good and merciful God. He wondered, in a whisper barely audible to his own ears, if the darkest side of the plague was not the illness itself, but the loss of hope and compassion, the surrender of love for one's neighbor in the name of survival. There was something even more terrifying in that thought, something that challenged all his monastic teachings, the idea that the plague didn't just kill bodies, it destroyed the very virtues that made the soul human, turning men into solitary wolves, prisoners of their own fear. Elias opened the great oak door with the caution of a thief, feeling the night air rush into the corridor, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and hay. The gate, made of massive oak planks bound by heavy wrought-iron hinges, was the work of centuries of craftsmanship, and he felt the cold metal of the latch beneath his hand, its coarse texture a small, grounding anchor to reality. The night wrapped around him with velvety darkness as he stepped into the muddy courtyard, the ground giving slightly under the weight of his boots. He looked out toward the vast darkness of the plain, where the village appeared only as a cluster of vague shapes, a few faint lights flickering like fallen stars. His mind wandered toward the unknown awaiting him below, the sickness, the despair, and the masked doctor he hoped to find, an unlikely ally in his search for a single act of mercy. His heart, beating fast like a trapped bird, told him that the true monastery was no longer the building behind him, but humanity itself, fragile, fearful, and waiting in the dark. Now, let your mind relax. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress, and follow Elias's trembling lantern as he walks away from the monastery. What does fear make us lose? And could a single act of kindness really bring light to the darkest of times? You'll learn more of this monk's journey and of the mysterious beaked doctor soon enough, once your mind grows quieter, ready to trace the footprints in the mud. Embrace the silence. Elias made his way down the hill that separated the monastery from the village. The dirt path was slick with nighttime moisture, coated in a thin layer of dew that made his leather boots creak softly, a muffled sound that still carried in the vast silence of the landscape. The air grew heavier as he neared the cluster of dwellings, bringing with it the pungent scent of burnt wood, mingled with something far more nauseating, a stubborn odor that the rain couldn't wash away, one that clung to the throat like proof that something was profoundly wrong with the natural order of things. Can you feel that damp cold rising from your feet, mingling with the nervous warmth of your skin? In the weak light of the oil lantern, the village of Saint-Ours looked as though it had shrunk beneath the weight of a curse. The wattle and daub cottages, once warm and lively, now resembled disordered coffins, their dark windows like hollow eyes staring blankly into the night. The thatched roofs, usually grey and weathered, appeared darker, almost black, under the starless sky. Moving carefully between the buildings, Elias tried not to stumble over abandoned farm tools or the carts left where they'd last been used, a haunting sign that flight had been sudden and desperate. He recalled a curious custom of his time. In moments of crisis or lesser epidemics, people often carried small silver or bone boxes called pomanders, filled with strong spices like clove, cinnamon, and amber. They believed that pleasant fragrances could drive away the pestilential air, thought to cause disease. Elias had no such charm, but instinctively lifted his linen cloth to cover his nose and mouth, a fragile, futile gesture, yet deeply human. It was an attempt to control the uncontrollable, to impose a small ritual of order upon the chaos pressing in around him. The monk stopped near the village fountain, a stone well where women once gathered during the day to wash clothes and exchange gossip, a place that had been the beating heart of the community. Now it stood eerily dry and abandoned, the monotony of silence broken only by the slow, mournful sound of a single drop falling into stagnant water. He could almost hear the echo of laughter, the splash of linen striking stone, the hum of life that once filled this space, a faint ghost of sound that made the present feel even lonelier, a somber counterpoint to the memory of recent vitality. The tension in the air didn't come from active danger, but from the sheer absence of life, a quiet that screamed louder than any church bell ever could, a void heavier than the din of battle. Elias thought of little Thomas, the orphan, and the hope of finding him alive flickered like a tiny flame in his chest, a light he shielded with the same care he gave to his lantern's trembling glow. It was the power of human compassion, a silent energy that pushed him forward, a force that defied the cold logic of self-preservation. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the beam of the lantern, and Elias's heart leapt in his chest, a sharp, rapid thump that was the only loud sound in that vast, silent night. It wasn't an animal nor a ghost, but a human figure, tall and strange, moving with the deliberate caution of someone well acquainted with darkness, exuding a quiet sense of purpose that sharply contrasted with the village's paralyzed despair. The figure wore a long, waxed leather coat that melted into the night like a second skin, and the unmistakable beaked mask, both terrifying and mesmerizing, covered his face. It was the physician, the medicus of rumor and legend, a near mythical figure, a lone knight waging war against death. He looked as though he had stepped straight out of a medieval nightmare, his long beak stuffed, as Elias knew, with fragrant herbs meant to repel the plague, a crude filter against an invisible threat. The sharp scent of camphor and sage, both medicinal and penetrating, added a new layer to the night's sensory tapestry, rising above the rot and damp wood to signal something different, the presence of one still searching for healing or at least understanding. The sight of him, however eerie, stirred a fragile spark of hope in Elias. There was no surrender in that posture, no resignation in that stride, only defiance, a refusal to accept the end as inevitable. The doctor carried a long staff, used more to push away the living and the dead than to steady his steps, and in his gloved hands, hands that could no longer feel skin, yet knew its texture by memory, he held a small leather satchel filled with strange tools, lancets for bloodletting, herbal balms, and opaque glass vials containing elixirs of doubtful origin but pure intent. Elias hesitated, clearing his throat, a sound that felt almost profane in the hush, and the doctor turned slowly, the bird-like mask pivoting toward him. The two glass lenses caught the lantern's reflection like cold eyes of polished stone. The voice that emerged from beneath the beak was low and muffled, filtered by cloth and herbs, yet calm, remarkably calm, without the panic or despair Elias had heard in every other survivor's voice. "You're one of the few still walking the night," said the doctor, his breathing slow and measured. "Your robe tells me you seek something more than food or a hasty burial. Tell me, monk, what draws you out from the safety of your walls? Is it faith that blinds you to danger, or hope, something I've yet to find in my herbs?" The question was not an accusation but an invitation, an opening between two men fighting the same battle by different means. Its quiet honesty reached Elias deeply, softening the fear that clung to him. He stepped forward through the mud, feeling the slick earth yield beneath his boots, and answered in a low but steady voice, careful to breathe through the linen over his mouth. "I'm looking for Thomas, the miller's orphan. He's sick and alone in his hut, and the abbot forbade us to help. But our rule says that charity knows no walls." He paused, locking eyes with the doctor's cold lenses, searching for any sign of kinship or judgment. "And you, master, do you seek a cure or understanding of the punishment? What is your mission beneath that dark mask?" The doctor didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head, a subtle avian motion, and pointed his staff toward the dark cluster of houses ahead. "I seek knowledge, monk. If this is divine punishment, then judgment belongs to God. But if it's a disease of flesh, then it's mine to uncover." He paused, the silence stretching between them, broken only by the faint crackle of oil burning in the lantern. "Come with me. The miller's house lies at the edge of the village, near the fields. It's a long walk. And tell me, why do your bells no longer ring?" Elias followed him, side by side, feeling oddly protected by the doctor's quiet presence. There was something almost poetic in that unlikely alliance, the man of God and the man of science, walking together not out of doctrine, but from the oldest human instinct, to care for those left behind. It was a small story of resistance against the dark, unfolding silently along the muddy street, a contrast between resignation and action, between prayer and observation. As they walked, Elias strained to hear the familiar sounds of night, the distant croak of a frog, the rustle of dry leaves. But the village's stillness swallowed every noise, turning the world unreal. He caught the heavy, sweet scent of burning flesh, the remnants of a body hastily cremated, a desperate act by neighbors trying to rid themselves of contagion. It was a practice that had become common, despite the church's prohibition, which still clung to the belief that only burial could redeem the soul. The doctor, who introduced himself only as Antoine, wore thick leather gloves that reached up to his elbows, a practical detail that revealed both his caution and his rudimentary understanding of how crucial it was to avoid direct contact with the sick and their fluids. It was a measure that set him apart from other healers who relied solely on prayers and charms. Elias noticed that Antoine always kept his eyes on the ground, avoiding the windows of the houses as if the danger didn't come from above, but crawled along the earth itself. Antoine began to speak in his muffled voice, sharing his observations from Italian cities he had fled before the plague consumed them. He told Elias that his main theory was that the disease didn't travel through the air, the miasma, but through clothes, fabrics, and objects touched by the infected. Curiously, his belief brought him closer to the truth that would only be discovered centuries later. He called these items fomites, and his fear of touching anything along the road seemed fully justified by that conviction. That was the second historical curiosity. The idea of fomites, lifeless objects that carried contagion, was developed by perceptive physicians of the time who noticed that even when the air seemed pure, the clothes and beds of the dead continued to kill. Their insight challenged the miasma theory and led to rudimentary disinfection practices such as burning straw and clothing. It was a small glimpse of reason amid a storm of superstition. Elias felt the cool air brush the exposed skin of his neck, contrasting with the warmth of his moving body, and realized that his anxiety had eased a little in Antoine's presence. The tension still lingered, yes, but it was balanced by the quiet hope this man represented, by his refusal to surrender to fate without a fight, by the simple dignity of a soul still trying. That contrast was what gave meaning to the horror. They passed a stone house, whose doors were chained shut with heavy locks and rusted iron. Antoine explained that it belonged to a wealthy merchant who had fled the village, taking his family and fortune with him, but leaving his sick servants behind, trapped inside to die slowly. The cruelty of self-preservation in the face of panic struck Elias harder than the fever itself. The story of that merchant, who traded his humanity for a few extra days of selfish safety, was a silent blow to the monk's heart. It showed him that the darkest side of the plague wasn't only in the inevitability of death, but in the deliberate choice to abandon compassion in exchange for survival. It was fear made flesh, transforming the rich man into an executioner and a neighbor into a stranger. "People," Antoine murmured beneath his mask, his voice heavy with dry, resigned sorrow, "aren't afraid of death, monk. They're afraid of abandonment. And it's abandonment, the absence of an outstretched hand, that spreads the plague faster than any bubo." His words echoed in Elias's mind, striking the very core of his mission. They reached the miller's hut, a small, humble structure of clay walls and a straw roof that smelled of mold and damp earth. The stench of sickness was stronger here, overwhelming, a metallic, putrid odor that seemed to vibrate in the air. Elias felt a wave of nausea, swallowing hard and forcing himself to remain calm. His body trembled, but his will did not yield. Antoine stopped at the door, lifting an oil lamp from his satchel to illuminate the entrance. He instructed Elias to wait, to keep his distance, and to touch nothing. a safety protocol learned through countless lost lives in other villages. That careful discipline was its own form of hope, proof that reason could sometimes overcome panic. "There's something even more remarkable," Antoine whispered, turning his bird-like head toward Elias. "Something you'll soon understand. These diseases don't only kill, they reveal who we are beneath the fear, when all our pretensions are stripped away. The door isn't locked, monk. That's already a sign. The poor never bother to lock their doors." He stepped inside, his strange silhouette cutting through the dark. The lamplight revealed the chaos within: an overturned bowl, an empty jug, a small wool blanket on the floor, and in the deepest shadow, the fragile, still body of Thomas, the orphan boy. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the heavy, feverish air close around him. His mission was now painfully real, tangible, and terrifying. The boy's small, motionless body had become the very center of his struggle, the symbol of innocence abandoned to silence and fear. A wave of cold determination swept through him. The monk's senses were fully alive. The sight of the dim hut, the overpowering stench of sickness, the suffocating warmth of the stagnant air, the ringing quiet, and the chill of night pressing against his skin. Antoine was bent over the child, his gloved hand touching Thomas's forehead and pulse. He muttered something Elias couldn't catch, a quick clinical assessment, the practiced murmur of a man who saw disease not as divine wrath, but as an enemy to be studied and understood, a voice of rationality amid madness. Elias took a step forward, ready to disobey Antoine's order, but froze when he heard a faint sound, a soft, trembling sob from the corner of the hut. It shattered the tension like glass. Thomas was alive. He was crying. It was a small victory, a counterpoint of hope, the most beautiful sound Elias could have imagined. His heart filled with sudden relief, a comforting warmth washing away the night's cold. The child wasn't just there, he was fighting. His weak sobs were a call, echoing louder than the silence of the monastery's bells. Charity had not come too late. The doctor rose slowly, the bird mask turning toward Elias. "He's alive, monk," Antoine said, his voice less muffled now, "but he's very weak. He has the fever and the marks, but there's still a chance. Now your charity will be tested, for he needs more than prayer. Will you take him with you?" Elias didn't hesitate. "I will," he replied. "Where there's life, there's hope, Master Antoine. And my vow is to charity, not cowardice." Kneeling on the filthy straw, he felt the coarse floor beneath his knees and reached for the frail, burning body of the boy. To a distant observer, the scene would have seemed the strangest of the century, a monk and a beaked doctor defying the Black Death to save an orphan. An image of unexpected goodness in the heart of tragedy, a small beam of light in the darkest night. The monk lifted the boy's light, feverish body, feeling the burning skin against the rough fabric of his robe. The smell of disease was overpowering, but Elias embraced it, cradling the child as though holding on to faith itself. His choice was an act of silent rebellion, against fear and against a church that had bowed to it. He knew the consequences would be severe, but as he felt the boy's weight in his arms, he understood something deeper. The true monastery was wherever compassion could still breathe. Elias stepped out into the night, carrying Thomas, and met the doctor's gaze. "We will meet again, Master Antoine," he said softly. "Your wisdom and my faith seem bound to the same fate. The monastery will be our battleground." The doctor inclined his head, the mask gleaming faintly in the lantern's light. "So be it, monk. Go now. And remember, disease doesn't forgive hesitation. But there's something deeper about this loss of compassion, something we'll uncover together." He didn't finish the sentence, but Elias understood. Thomas's survival wasn't merely a question of life or death. It was a test for the very soul of the Middle Ages. The wind outside carried the faint hum of insects, a sound that seemed almost sacred after so much silence. Elias paused for a moment, feeling the boy's shallow breath against his chest. That fragile rhythm, barely perceptible, was enough to make the darkness feel less absolute. The world was still cruel, yes, but not entirely lost. He began the long walk back toward the monastery, his sandals pressing into the damp soil. The moonlight, pale and uncertain, spread across the path like a veil of silver dust. Antoine followed a few paces behind, his oil lamp swinging rhythmically, each sway illuminating fragments of broken carts, scattered tools, and the silent testimony of abandoned lives. The smell of damp straw and distant smoke drifted from the village. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. The night was so still that even the whisper of Elias's robe brushing his legs sounded loud. Yet within that stillness he sensed movement, an invisible presence, the quiet pulse of life resisting extinction. The monk's mind wandered through the faces he had seen that day, men sealing their doors, women praying through tears, children left to fate. But none of those memories carried as much weight as the one he now held in his arms. Thomas's small, feverish body was the embodiment of mercy, proof that one act of compassion could still defy an empire of despair. Antoine broke the silence first. "You understand now, don't you?" he said softly, his voice echoing through the mask. "This plague, it's not only in the flesh, it's in what people allow themselves to become." His tone was not accusatory but weary. A man who had seen too many transformations, too many souls devoured by fear. Elias nodded, though his throat was too tight to answer. The road ahead shimmered faintly with dew. He thought of the words of Saint Benedict, "Laborare est orare," to work is to pray. Tonight, carrying this child was his labor, his prayer, his defiance. They reached the riverbank, where the reeds bent under the weight of the wind. Elias stopped to adjust his grip on Thomas, whose skin glistened with fever. He dipped a corner of his sleeve into the cool water and pressed it to the boy's forehead. The child stirred faintly, a sign that the spirit had not yet surrendered. Antoine watched him quietly. "If every monk had your resolve," he said, "the plague would find fewer victims." Elias looked up, surprised by the softness in the doctor's tone. "You mistake faith for courage," the monk replied. "I am afraid, Master Antoine, but fear is not an excuse to stop loving." For a long moment neither spoke. Only the rustle of the reeds and the slow rhythm of the water filled the air. Then Antoine said, "Perhaps it is not faith or courage we need, but memory, to remember what we were before fear taught us to be cruel." The monastery appeared in the distance, a dark silhouette against the horizon, its tower like a finger pointing toward heaven or warning it. The faint light of a candle flickered through one of the narrow windows. Elias felt both comforted and condemned by that sight. When they reached the gate, Antoine halted. "I will not enter," he said quietly. "Your brothers will not welcome me. My mask is not the face of faith." Elias hesitated, wanting to argue, but he saw the truth in the doctor's words. "Then pray for me in your way," he said softly, "and I will pray for you in mine." The doctor inclined his head. "If there is mercy left in this world, monk, it will find us both, though perhaps not in the same place." Then, with a small nod, he turned and disappeared into the mist, his silhouette fading like a memory swallowed by time. Elias stood for a long while, holding the child, listening to the sound of his own heart. The heavy doors of the monastery loomed before him, carved with saints who seemed to watch his every hesitation. He knocked softly, 3 measured taps that echoed through the stone like distant thunder. A younger monk opened the door, his eyes widening at the sight of the boy. "Brother Elias," he whispered, "what have you done?" Elias stepped inside, feeling the shift in the air, the warmth of oil lamps, the scent of wax and damp stone. "What I was called to do," he answered. "I brought back a soul." Inside, the monastery was both sanctuary and prison. The long corridors were dimly lit, the silence so dense that each step felt sacrilegious. Elias walked toward the infirmary, ignoring the murmurs that trailed behind him. He laid Thomas gently on a bed of clean straw, the boy's face now calm in the flickering light. He lit a candle and placed it beside the bed. Its flame danced, golden and small, casting long shadows across the walls. The warmth it radiated was enough to thaw something inside him, a corner of his heart that had grown cold with obedience. "You are safe now," he murmured to the child. "As long as this light burns, you are not alone." For the first time that night, Elias allowed himself to sit, his body trembling from exhaustion. The weight of his robe felt heavier than armor, and yet he sensed that something unseen had shifted, that compassion, once ignited, could not be extinguished. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to stain the sky with pale gold. The world was still diseased, still cruel, but within the small walls of the infirmary there was balance again. Fear and faith, despair and mercy, life and death, all breathing together, quietly. The monk closed his eyes, letting the faint warmth of the candle touch his face. He no longer needed to pray for strength. The act itself had become his prayer. In that fragile peace, surrounded by silence and shadow, Elias realized that salvation had never been distant. It had been waiting, hidden within the act of reaching out one trembling hand toward another. Elias climbed the hill back toward the monastery, the small, fever-warm body of the orphan Thomas in his arms, feeling at once impossibly light from the child's frailty and unbearably heavy from the weight of his decision. Each step through the slippery mud was an act of defiance. He could feel the roughness of the earth, the slope beneath his boots, and the growing strain in his arms, while the fear of being caught by the monastery's night patrol tightened with every meter he advanced. The chill of dawn yielded to the child's feverish heat, a sensory contrast that mirrored the entire gravity of his situation. Thomas's shallow, rasping breaths were the only clear sound in the stillness, each faint exhale a fragile whisper of life struggling to persist amid the graveyard silence that surrounded them. Elias walked with the care of one carrying a vessel made of glass, knowing that one misstep could shatter everything, endangering both the boy's life and his own place within the abbey. The scent of sickness, a sweet, clinging odor, had already seeped into his robes, becoming something intimate, a burden he had chosen to bear. It followed him like a quiet vow, demanding his constant attention, a physical reminder of the choice he had made. In the distance, the massive silhouette of the stone monastery rose against the lightening sky, a solemn block of shadow that now looked less like a sanctuary and more like a prison, or perhaps a testing ground where compassion would soon be weighed against law and doctrine. The cold morning air pricked his exposed skin, yet the child's fevered warmth shielded him from feeling the chill entirely, as though the boy's heat were both a thermal and moral barrier against the creeping cold of fear. He thought of Antoine's words, the beaked doctor's remark about how the poor never bothered to lock their doors, and his mind wandered to the cruelty of a society that equated poverty not just with the absence of possessions, but with the absence of worth and protection. The Black Death hadn't invented abandonment. It had merely exposed it in all its naked horror, like a polished silver mirror reflecting the ugliest face of medieval humanity. Elias reached the monastery's side door, a small service entrance used by monks for tending the gardens and stables. He felt the rough, damp texture of the wood beneath his fingertips as he searched for the balance point to lift the heavy latch. The door groaned faintly as it gave way, the sharp creak slicing through the morning's hush and making his heart race with a sudden, silent panic. He moved faster, less carefully now, driven by instinct and the desperate rhythm of hope. As he stepped into the inner courtyard, Elias found himself beneath the towering shadow of the cloister, where the faint morning light began to touch the stone columns, revealing the cold, moss-covered dampness of the walls, a scent of ancient stone and neglected sanctity lingering in the air. He had to move quickly and silently, for soon the day's routine would begin. The monks would rise for lauds, the first morning office, when the risk of discovery would be far greater. The bells still remained silent, yet the rhythm of the monastery went on, unyielding as if in ritual denial of the world's collapse beyond its walls. Elias slipped toward the infirmary, a small annex apart from the main dormitories, once used for minor wounds and common illnesses, but now feeling more like a forbidden place, a chamber of isolation. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, mostly chamomile and pennyroyal, a smell that had once been comforting, but now felt stifled beneath the sharp, metallic odor of sickness that clung to the boy he carried. He laid Thomas gently upon a clean bed of straw, feeling the weight leave his arms, a momentary relief quickly replaced by a surge of worry. The boy coughed, a dry, rasping sound that scratched the stillness of the room, and turned slightly, revealing the dark purple blotches and swollen buboes beneath his arm and near his groin. Terrifying, unmistakable signs of the plague he had tried so hard to ignore. Acting quickly, Elias recalled the whispered instructions Antoine had given him on the hill. Total isolation, fresh air, and the preparation of a strong herbal infusion to help the body sweat, to drive out the poison within. It was a practice rooted in the ancient theories of humors, flawed, yes, but the best medicine their world had to offer. The boy's skin felt dry and rough under Elias's fingers, burning with the fever that consumed him from within. There was, in fact, a fascinating truth about monastic medicine of that time. Many monasteries kept their own herb gardens, herbarium, and their infirmary monks were often the only true healers of the Middle Ages, blending the teachings of Dioscorides and Galen with faith and prayer, making botanical knowledge a sacred part of religious life. Elias was drawing from that tradition now, even as he broke the rule of isolation to do it. He prepared a simple infusion of chamomile and honey, breathing in the warm, sweet aroma rising from the small clay pot, a scent that stood in soft contrast to the oppressive air of sickness around him. He tried to offer it to the boy, whose lips were cracked and dry. The feel of the warm pot in his hands was a comfort against the chill of the morning, though its gentle heat was nothing compared to the fire raging within Thomas. As he tended to the child, Elias couldn't help but reflect on the cruel paradox of his time. The Church, the guardian of charity and compassion, had locked itself away in fear, while a secular, masked doctor guided by reason had shown more humanity. He wondered whether the true plague was not Yersinia pestis itself, but rather the pestilence of indifference spreading faster than any bacillus, infecting souls instead of bodies. What unfolded in that small infirmary was a quiet, intimate act of resistance, a single monk defying an entire religious and social order in the name of a child who was no one. It was an act of pure kindness that shone brighter against the backdrop of fear, a moment of courage the official chronicles would forget, but one that truly defined what it meant to be human. Elias sat at the edge of the straw bed, watching the faint rise and fall of Thomas's chest. The stillness of the infirmary had become his new monastery, a place of vigilance and fragile hope, standing in quiet opposition to the formal cloister outside. The silence was broken only by the gentle crackle of the small fire he had lit, the soft sigh of heat expanding through the wood, and the quiet murmur of his own prayers, prayers that were now less about salvation and more about endurance. The light filtering through the infirmary's narrow windows was pale and cold, yet as the sun climbed, it took on a faint golden hue. painting the wall with the illusion of warmth. The monk felt the coarse texture of his wool robe against his skin, a constant amid fear and change, a physical reminder of his calling. He needed a plan, for Thomas's presence could not remain a secret for long. He thought of Abbot Theophilus, a good man, but one bound tightly to the rule and paralyzed by the terror of contagion. It was he who had ordered total isolation, believing that preserving the monastery meant preserving a remnant of divine order on earth. Elias now found himself torn between two sacred vows, charity and obedience, a moral tension more painful than any bodily affliction. He knew the abbot feared that if the monastery were contaminated, the knowledge and manuscripts kept within its walls, the only surviving records of centuries of wisdom and history, would be lost forever. And Elias wondered whether preserving memory was truly worth more than preserving a single innocent life. That, he thought, was the deepest question the Black Death had brought to humankind. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cool sweat on his skin and the sharp scent of herbs in the air. He needed Antoine, the doctor, not only for his knowledge of illness, but for his unflinching perspective, his ability to see things in terms of cause and effect rather than sin and punishment. There was something else he needed to understand. The rumors that Antoine had not cured anyone with his remedies, yet his relentless observations, his determination to document every detail of the plague, were forming a body of knowledge that might become humanity's true defense against the next epidemic. The doctor was not fighting for the present, but for the future. That revelation, the idea that Antoine was building an inheritance of understanding from suffering, brought Elias a quiet, uplifting sense of purpose. Thomas's death might be inevitable, but his pain and the monk's small act of compassion would become a single stone in the foundation of something greater, the only lasting way to fight the darkness. Elias made a silent vow. Even if the boy died, he would record every detail, each symptom, each small act of care, as a tribute both to suffering and to Antoine's work. He reached for a quill and a scrap of parchment, feeling the soft tip brush his fingertip, and began to write in the tiny, careful hand he had mastered in the scriptorium. The infirmary, warm and hushed, had transformed into a small laboratory, a center of resistance against the night, where faith and science joined in a single purpose, defying the laws of fear that ruled the world outside. The monk and the doctor, allied in the darkness, were the living antithesis of the abandonment-consuming society. He looked at Thomas, who seemed to drift in uneasy sleep, his brow furrowed in pain. Elias knew discovery was near, and that both his faith and his place in the monastery were in jeopardy. But there was something more, something only the doctor knew. Antoine had told him that the true horror of the Black Death lay beyond the fever, and the monk was about to find out what he meant. Elias knew the abbot would soon find him, and that his choice would bear consequences. Yet the faint warmth of the orphan's small body in his arms was the only proof he needed that he had done the right thing. The touch of life, however fragile, was stronger than any shadow of death. Now, let your mind drift toward rest, as daylight rises above the monastery. What will happen when faith and fear finally meet? The morning sun had already risen fully, flooding the monastery's stone courtyard with a cold, clear light. But inside the small infirmary, Elias kept the heavy wool curtains drawn, creating an artificial twilight that shielded the restless sleep of little Thomas. The air was thick with the mingled scents of herbs and sickness, a dense, stifling atmosphere that the monk tried to ease by opening a narrow slit at the top of the window, letting in a thread of cool morning air scented with hay and wet grass. He felt the chill of parchment under his hand as he continued recording his observations of the boy. The color of his skin, the rhythm of his breathing, the frequency of his coughs, the size of the dark swellings, each note an attempt to give form and name to horror, to transform a divine curse into something that could be understood. It was a subtle but profound shift, from the religious to the observational, a quiet revolution within his own mind. The stillness of morning was abruptly broken by the heavy, deliberate echo of footsteps on stone, followed by the sharp scent of incense and wax, a clear sign of the approach of Abbot Theophilus and Prior Anselm, making their ritual morning inspection of the abbey. Elias's heart began to race, each beat thudding so loudly it seemed to fill the air, a pulse of fear that rose like heat along his neck, clashing with the cool air seeping through the window crack. He moved quickly, covering Thomas's small body with a thick wool blanket to hide the marks of the plague. He slid his parchment of notes beneath a stack of clean linens, restoring the room to its usual order, an image of calm normalcy ready to withstand scrutiny. His thoughts ran with the frantic speed of panic, but his movements were steady and deliberate, guided by years of monastic discipline, a contrast between inner urgency and outward composure. The door opened slowly, with deliberate weight, revealing the imposing figure of Abbot Theophilus, an older man dressed in fine linen robes, his expression stern and unreadable. Beside him stood Prior Anselm, younger, with sharp, watchful eyes, and a posture so rigid it seemed carved from stone. He carried with him the scent of blind obedience. The abbot paused on the threshold, his gaze sweeping the small room, his eyes fixed on Elias, then on the bed. He could feel the heavy air, the unnatural warmth, and the strange mingling of herbs and illness, a world away from the sterile sanctity he demanded. The abbot cleared his throat, a dry, authoritative sound that shattered the tense silence, and his voice, though calm, carried the full weight of fear and command. "Novice Elias," he began, his tone measured and deliberate, "what are you doing here, away from your duties in the scriptorium, and what is that smell lingering in the air? You know the rule. No one enters, no one leaves, and the infirmary is sealed from contagion. We guard this place so that the sacred knowledge within these walls is not lost." Elias bowed his head, forcing his body to relax and his voice to remain steady. He felt the coarse wool of his robe brush against his skin and answered with proper reverence, but with a quiet resolve beneath the formality. "Reverend Father, I tend the fire to keep the air dry, as is our custom, and I've been preparing chamomile tea for anxious souls, using recipes from our old herbarium. The scent you notice is only the herbs, Father, a simple comfort." The abbot didn't look entirely convinced. His gaze settled on the small, still figure beneath the blanket, a presence that had no place in an infirmary, meant to stand empty. He took a step forward, the chill of the stone floor seeping through his leather sandals. "And who lies here, Elias? I gave no order to bring anyone into the cloister. Not even a peasant should cross our quarantine. Fear, Elias, is the wisdom of preservation." Prior Anselm moved slightly to the side, suspicion glinting in his eyes as he tried to get a clearer view of what was under the blanket. Elias could feel the weight of that gaze, a silent duel between obedience and compassion. He needed a counterpoint, a flicker of humanity to break through the wall of fear. "It's little Thomas, Father Abbot," Elias said softly, letting warmth enter his voice. "The miller's orphan, the boy who brought flour to our kitchen, always smiling despite the dust on his face. He suffers only a mild fever, Father. If I'd left him in the village, he would have died alone. Is it not our rule to shelter and protect the innocent?" The mention of Thomas, the boy with the flour-stained smile, struck something in the old man. The abbot paused, his severe expression softening ever so slightly, and Elias sensed the faintest crack in the wall of authority, a flicker of compassion breaking through duty. That was the small story, the story of humble service turned plea for mercy. Elias had used memory as his argument, invoking the boy's simple goodness. It worked because the abbot, at his core, was not cruel, only terrified, his fear louder than his faith. The abbot drew a deep breath, the sharp scent of incense rising from his robes, a symbolic shield against the invisible threat. He weighed his choices, feeling the burden of command pressing on him, the dilemma between saving one life and protecting many, between individual mercy and communal survival. "If it is but a winter fever, then so be it," the abbot said at last, his voice returning to its grave steadiness, though tinged now with weary resignation. "But you alone will bear responsibility for his care and his quarantine. You are not to leave this room, nor touch another soul. And if the sickness worsens, it will be you who buries him, beyond the walls. Do not lose your soul to disobedience, Elias. Fear sometimes is a friend." He turned, his wool cloak brushing the air as he left the room. His footsteps echoed down the stone corridor, followed by Prior Anselm, who cast a long, distrustful glance back at Elias before departing. The door closed with a soft click, and the stale air seemed to settle once more. The scent of sickness hung heavier than before, but now it was mingled with the faint, fleeting fragrance of relief. Elias felt warmth surge through him, a gentle wave of relief that loosened the tightness in his chest. The tension had given way to fragile hope. The orphan was safe within the monastery under his care, and his disobedience had been quietly forgiven in the name of sentimental charity. It was a small victory, but a vital one in his private battle against the indifference the plague had birthed. He moved closer to Thomas's bed, feeling the cool linen beneath his hands as he pulled the blanket down to check on the boy, whose eyes, wide and fever-bright, met his own. The touch of Elias's fingers against the child's hot forehead was the only contact he allowed himself, a tender, forbidden gesture. The monk smiled softly, a smile the boy could barely see, but one he could sense in the calm rhythm of Elias's voice. "Rest now, little Thomas. The monastery will be your home for a while. You're safe here. Our battle is with the fever, not with fear. Remember, faith does not lock itself behind walls." He sat again and resumed writing on the parchment, his quill moving with a new urgency and purpose. The medieval monastery's role as a sanctuary and place of care, something he had once known only through theory, had now become a living truth. Despite the abbot's decrees, the monastery had quietly reclaimed its original mission: to heal. The silence of the infirmary wrapped around him like a cocoon, sheltering him from the chaos of the world outside. He noticed the strong, earthy scent of his own robes, carrying with them traces of the muddy streets, the stench of disease, and the restless sweat of a long night, a blend of smells that marked him as both an intruder and, paradoxically, purified. His thoughts drifted to Antoine, wondering where the beaked doctor might be now, still wandering through the dark veins of the plague, recording, observing, fighting in silence. Elias knew he needed his help, a new secret meeting under the cover of night, for Thomas's fever would not yield to teas and prayers alone. And yet, beneath the relief, a sharper fear lingered. What if the sickness spread? What if other monks fell ill? The weight of that thought pressed upon him like the stones of the cloister. He began to wonder if his compassion might, in truth, be a dangerous kind of selfishness, an attempt to save his own soul at the risk of the community's safety. That was the new tension defining his story, the taut line between hope and dread, between love and self-preservation. The plague did not only force choices between life and death, it demanded choices between the individual and the collective, between the heart and the law. Elias lifted the small clay bowl of warm tea, feeling its smooth texture in his hands, and gently encouraged Thomas to drink. His voice was soft and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby improvised from instinct, a sound that soothed the child's trembling body and at the same time calmed the monk's own anxious heart. Through this quiet ritual of care and observation, Elias felt more alive, more present than he had ever been. His life of study and prayer seemed distant now. His true calling had revealed itself, not in the sacred texts, but in the fragile, burning body of an abandoned child. Life itself had become a laboratory of faith. He knew the peace would not last, that Prior Anselm would not let the matter rest, and that Thomas's illness was only beginning. But for now, the stillness of the infirmary, the scent of herbs, and the soft sound of the boy's breathing were his whole precious reality. Elias watched Thomas's small, fevered hand resting outside the blanket, the dry, hot skin beneath his fingertips, and noticed a faint, repetitive gesture. The boy's thumb moved intermittently toward his mouth, not to suck, but in a motion of seeking and comfort. It was a child's instinctive habit, one the illness hadn't erased, a quiet reflection of deep helplessness. That tiny human detail, the unconscious movement of a soul still reaching for safety, became Elias's focus in that moment of stillness, a fragile symbol of the life he fought to protect. The monk shaped a poetic comparison in his mind. Thomas's hand was like a small, dried leaf, trembling in the wind, clinging to the only branch it knew, its own innocence, while the storm of plague tried to tear it away. That soft, rhythmic repetition was proof that the boy's mind, though feverish and lost in confusion, still searched instinctively for a harbor amid the tempest. He recalled a curious medieval custom of comfort, the belief that touching a relic or blessed object could ward off evil. And though Elias knew the fever would not yield to superstition, he took his small wooden crucifix, its surface smooth and cool from years of prayer-worn fingers, and placed it gently beside the boy's hand. It was less an act of blind faith than one of human warmth, a quiet assurance that the child was not alone. The mingled scents of sweat, herbs, and sickness had become a constant presence in the infirmary. Yet Elias was growing used to them. The fragrance of chamomile and pennyroyal had begun to feel almost comforting, a perfume of struggle and endurance. The touch of parchment beneath his hand grounded him in the moment as he continued recording each small detail of the boy's condition, like a sculptor giving form to something invisible. The monastery's silence, slow and methodical, was the perfect counterpoint to Elias's anxious thoughts. He could faintly hear the dragging footsteps of monks in the cloister during the morning offices, the distant drone of Gregorian chant. A monotonous yet reassuring sound, proof that some order still held, that the world beyond had not yet completely collapsed. But there was something else in that steady rhythm, a different voice waiting to be heard, one that promised to change everything. Suddenly, the stillness was broken, not by footsteps, but by something subtler, a faint scratching against the infirmary door, soft and deliberate. It wasn't the knock of a hand, but the brush of some object, followed by a muffled whisper. Elias lifted his head, feeling a surge of alarm rise through his neck, his eyes locking onto the dark door where the dim light from the corridor barely seeped through. "It's me, monk. Antoine." The voice came low and filtered through the wood, the deep, measured tone of the plague doctor. It carried both threat and relief, danger in his presence, hope in his arrival. Elias's heart leapt with conflicting emotions. He needed Antoine, but letting him in could shatter the fragile truce he'd earned with the abbot. Moving with the stealth of a cat, Elias slipped across the room, the rough wool of his robe brushing his legs. He cracked the door open just enough to slide through, closing it quickly behind him to seal in the contaminated air. In the faint lantern glow of the corridor, Antoine's silhouette emerged, tall, strange, almost spectral. The doctor was more covered than before, with fresh leather gloves and a new pair of glass lenses in his mask. The scent of camphor and vinegar, a crude disinfectant of the time, hung heavily around him, sharp and medicinal, carrying the aura of endless labor among the dying. His gloved hand, when it brushed the door, moved with a cautious precision, as though even touch itself could be dangerous. Antoine wasted no words on greeting. His voice, muffled and direct, spoke with the weary authority of a man who had seen too much. "I've brought what may help, if anything still can. It's theriac, the best mixture I could find in the city stores, blended with strong wine. It will make the boy sweat if he's strong enough to fight. That's the best we have, monk. The rest lies in God's mercy if he's still watching." Theriac, Elias thought, recalling its history, a legendary cure-all of the Middle Ages made from dozens of ingredients, opium, honey, even viper's flesh. It was believed to ward off poison and disease alike, a desperate symbol of faith in alchemy and ancient wisdom, a quiet moment of drama wrapped inside a simple clay flask. Antoine extended the small jar, its mouth sealed with red wax. Elias took it carefully, feeling the cool, heavy weight of the clay, hope, fragile and uncertain, resting in his palm. The scent that escaped the seal was sweet and foreign, a swirl of exotic spices utterly out of place in the damp air of the monastery. "There's one thing you mustn't forget, monk," Antoine whispered, the beak of his mask tilting slightly, the lantern's glow glinting off his glass eyes. "Theriac can soothe, but it doesn't cure what's killing him. What truly kills isn't the fever or the swellings, it's panic. It's the abandonment that leaves a man with nothing left to fight for." Elias felt the weight of that truth settle over him, a deep human wisdom hidden beneath the doctor's matter-of-fact tone. Thomas's story was not just one of sickness, but of despair. The monk's act of compassion, his refusal to let the boy die alone, was the real medicine. Hope itself was the counterpoint to the plague's relentless darkness. Elias tightened his grip on the theriac flask, feeling the rough, cool texture of the clay against his palm, and looked up at the masked doctor, his determination hardening. "Prior Anselm is watching, Master Antoine. If he sees you, both my charity and your wisdom will stand trial, and the abbot has already warned me." Antoine inclined his head slowly, the glass eyes of his mask glinting like cold puddles in dim light. "Fear, monk, has its own liturgy, and the prior is its acolyte. I come and go like a shadow, but your struggle is far more dangerous than mine, for your enemy lives within your own walls, and there's something else you should know about that enemy of yours." He paused, his muffled breathing echoing softly through the beak of his mask. Elias felt his nerves tighten again, the chill of unease returning to his spine. He had prepared himself for disease, not for betrayal. The true horror of the plague, he realized, was not in the dying. It was in the slow unraveling of trust, the decay of human fellowship. "Prior Anselm has been secretly collecting the belongings of dead monks from the nearby villages," Antoine whispered, his voice low and urgent. "He claims the objects carry the evil, but his real motive is greed. He's using the plague as a veil for plunder. The darkest face of this pestilence isn't the sickness, it's what it allows human nature to do unseen." That was the revelation, the quiet climax, greed and treachery flourishing beneath the shroud of fear and quarantine. Elias was no longer fighting only fever and contagion. He was standing against the corruption the plague had awakened in men's souls. His hope to save Thomas had become a moral counterweight to the rot that festered in the prior's heart. A chill ran through the monk's body, sharper than the night air, contrasting with the faint warmth of the flask in his hand. The rough, cold stone beneath his feet felt suddenly more tangible, more real, grounding him amid the intangible horror of deceit. Prior Anselm did not fear God. He feared only poverty. "I'll return tomorrow under the veil of darkness. Keep the shutters closed and continue the tea," Antoine said finally, turning to leave. His tall, strange silhouette slipped back into the corridor's shadows, the scent of camphor lingering behind him like the fading trace of a mystery. When Elias re-entered the infirmary, the shift in temperature struck him, the thick, warm air embracing him again. He glanced at Thomas, restless in his fevered sleep, then at the theriac in his hands, no longer just medicine, but a symbol of defiance against the darkness. He prepared the dose carefully, the sweet, pungent smell of the mixture filling the air, and helped the boy drink it, watching as Thomas swallowed with effort. Sitting by the bedside, Elias watched the child's frail chest rise and fall, and silently vowed to protect him, and to expose the prior's greed. His eyes lingered on the small wooden crucifix beside Thomas's hand, the smooth, time-worn surface cool against his fingers. In that moment, Elias felt a new kind of faith, not in the rigid laws of the church, but in the quiet endurance of compassion, in the small human story of resistance he was now part of. The contrast between Anselm's avarice and his own charity had become his moral armor. Now let your mind rest. As Brother Elias keeps vigil in the dim light of the infirmary, the flask of theriac warm in his hands, and a dangerous secret burning in his heart. What will he do with the knowledge of Prior Anselm's greed? The following morning carried with it a deeper stillness, a silence that stretched beyond the monastery walls, swallowing even the usual sounds of monastic life, as though the world itself were tightening its grip around that last fragile bastion of order. Inside the infirmary, the heavy, sweet scent of theriac mingled with the steam of herbal tea and the sour trace of fever, creating a dense medicinal haze that Elias tried to thin by opening the shutters just enough to let the morning chill brush softly against his skin. Little Thomas was reacting to the medicine, but in a way that both alarmed and consoled him. The fever had risen higher, and his small body, beneath the blanket, was drenched in sweat. An intense reaction, Elias hoped, was the illness being forced out, though the boy's labored breathing made the scene feel like a fragile balance between life and surrender. The linen sheets clung damply beneath his fingers as he changed the compresses, his touch tracing the heat that pulsed through the child's frail frame, a dangerous warmth, the body's own desperate act of resistance. As Elias kept his vigil, his mind began to drift beyond the narrow room, widening its focus to the monastery itself, a microcosm of the medieval world, still clinging to its rituals while chaos raged beyond its gates. He thought of the other monks, their rigid, repetitive routines, each prayer and gesture serving as a collective denial of the disorder outside, a fragile illusion of control against the inevitability of fate. He knew that most of his brothers came from noble or wealthy families, bringing into the cloister habits and anxieties that had little to do with the purity of renunciation. Many monasteries of the time, as centers of both spiritual and economic power, required a dowry for entry, meaning that even within walls built for humility, the quiet echo of social hierarchy persisted. Gold had found a way to slip under the door of God's house. That thought resonated painfully with what Antoine had revealed about Prior Anselm. The prior's greed was not an isolated flaw. It was a symptom, a reflection of the corruption that could take root even in sanctified soil. It was a cruel mirror of the age, the ideal of holiness corrupted by the lure of possession, the divine overshadowed by human weakness. And that, Elias realized, was the plague's darkest face, not the fever that burned flesh, but the opportunity it gave to the hidden sickness of the soul. Elias sat on a small wooden stool, feeling the rough texture of the wood beneath his palms as his gaze wandered around the room. his attention fixed on the architecture, the cold, steadfast stones laid centuries ago, each one a testament to endurance and faith in a world of constant decay. The monastery itself was built to outlast mortality, its permanence standing in quiet opposition to the fragile, fevered life of Thomas. He thought of the scriptorium, the room where he had spent most of his days, filled with the faint scent of walnut ink and parchment. The light there was always dim, yet patience infinite. The monk's slow, deliberate copying of texts was not just work. It was an act of preservation, a quiet defiance against time and ignorance. And now, the plague threatened to erase in months what centuries of hands and ink had built. A gentle metaphor formed in his mind. The child's burning body was like one of those ancient manuscripts, fragile, irreplaceable, and precious. The disease was fire or flood, seeking to blur the letters of life into oblivion. His work here, in this dim infirmary, was only an extension of his duty in the scriptorium, the preservation of something sacred, the transcription of a miracle of endurance. He recalled his conversation with Antoine, the beaked doctor. Hope, the physician had implied, came not from prayer alone, but from movement, from the mixing of herbs, the act of observation, the refusal to yield to fear. It was a philosophy of action, standing in sharp contrast to the paralysis and resignation that now governed the monastery, where dread had become the only unspoken rule. Still, the tension of his secret gnawed at him. Prior Anselm, with his watchful eyes and his morbid habit of collecting the possessions of the dead, loomed like a shadow within the light of Elias's compassion. The monk could feel the chill of suspicion on his skin, a subtle shiver that had nothing to do with the morning air. He knew he would need to move in darkness, as Antoine did, to protect not only Thomas, but also the moral fabric of the monastery from the prior's greed. The struggle had outgrown the confines of a sick room. It was no longer just for one orphan's survival, but for the soul of the entire community. The soft crackle of burning wood reached his ears, the scent of smoke and resin filling the air. That small fire, steady and alive, became his refuge. Its warmth on his hands, its smell, its sound, these were his anchors to the present, to the tangible world of senses. In that quiet moment, Elias clung to the micro, the heat, the scent, the texture, to shield himself from the crushing vastness of plague, greed, and fear. The monk continued to observe Thomas, noticing that despite the sweat and fever, the swollen purple buboes seemed to have shrunk ever so slightly. A small detail, a fragile sign of hope that stood in quiet defiance of the disease's oppression. That tiny victory sparked a faint but vital glow of optimism in his heart, a fragile thread of relief holding the moment together. A second thought crossed his mind, one of those everyday details that now felt oddly distant: water and bathing. Contrary to later myths, bathing in the Middle Ages was not rare. Monasteries had ritual baths and many towns maintained public ones. Yet the plague had turned people away from water, convinced it opened their pores to contagion, a superstition that ironically worsened hygiene and deepened the stench of fear. Elias longed to wash the boy, to soothe the sticky sweat and cleanse the scent of sickness from his frail body, but the warning against water echoed in his thoughts, a superstition turned law. So instead, he dipped a linen cloth into warm water and gently wiped Thomas's skin, the soft texture of the fabric gliding over fevered flesh, a small act of tenderness in a time when touch itself had become a risk. That simple motion became a prayer in silence, a human gesture of care against the brutality of the world outside. Elias wondered how many lives might have been spared if people had chosen compassion over fear, if one touch of mercy could have outweighed 1,000 acts of abandonment. His thoughts drifted between the micro and the macro, the intimate care of a single child, and the vast social collapse outside. The plague had stripped away illusions, exposing the truth that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in generosity, the one currency that could not be infected. Elias's quiet defiance became the moral counterpoint to the prior's greed. While Anselm scavenged what was material, Elias preserved what was spiritual, the fragile flame of life and compassion. The contrast was vivid, the prior cloaked in shadow, Elias bathed in the soft, forgiving light of the infirmary, but the monk knew that peace could not last. Soon he would have to leave the safety of that quiet room to confront the prior, not with violence, but with truth. He needed proof of the man's corruption, evidence that would protect not only Thomas, but the integrity of the monastery itself. His mission had grown from healing a child to redeeming a community. The infirmary's calm was the peak of his brief serenity, a moment of stillness before the inevitable storm. Thomas now slept more peacefully, his small hand resting near the wooden crucifix. Life clung to him by a thread, but it was a strong one. Elias drew a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dense air of the infirmary, the mingled scents of herbs, sweat, and persistence, and allowed himself a moment of deep reflection. The plague was not the end of the world, but the end of an age. It was forcing humanity to decide what was truly essential. Madame, just by midday, the sun had reached its height, its rays filtering through the thick wool curtains of the infirmary, turning the interior into a dim, golden refuge, a sanctuary from the harsh brilliance outside. Elias sat in quiet contemplation, his body still, his mind resting, watching Thomas's chest rise and fall with steadier rhythm, a fragile pulse of hope against the chaos he knew waited beyond the stone walls. The lingering scent of theriac mingled with the faint aroma of lavender he had sprinkled on the straw mattress, his attempt to purify the air. In his hands, the cool ceramic bowl that once held tea grounded him, a small, tangible anchor amid intangible fears. The silence of the monastery at noon, after the sex prayers, wrapped around him like a cloak. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire, steady and rhythmic, the very embodiment of persistence, a reminder that warmth and calm could still exist in a world unraveling. He thought of something he had often observed through the years, the importance of sunlight in medieval life. People revered natural light as a symbol of the divine, and great cathedrals had been designed to welcome it through stained glass, turning illumination into prayer. But now, under the shadow of the plague, sunlight itself had become suspect. Many feared that the sun's heat carried bad air, sealing their homes against the very light they once called holy. Elias, however, had defied that fear. He had opened the shutters just enough to let in air and a sliver of sunlight, an instinctive act of rebellion that felt essential for Thomas's healing. The faint warmth on his skin reminded him that not everything from the outside world was dangerous. Nature, he thought, was not cruel. It was merely indifferent, and in that indifference, man's kindness was what gave the world its fragile meaning. The stillness allowed Elias's thoughts to sink deeper into contemplation of the Black Death, not as a single tragedy, but as a cultural revelation, a magnifying glass that exposed the structural flaws of his world. He began to see the plague not merely as divine punishment or random fate, but as a mirror reflecting human inequality. The greed of Prior Anselm was not an isolated sin. It was a symptom, a small story of corruption that mirrored the larger moral collapse of society itself. He recalled the scent of freshly carved wood and pigments in the scriptorium, the fragrance of creation and preservation, and contrasted it with the stench of decay and rot that clung to the village below. The difference was staggering, a sensory duel between life and death, between the crafting of beauty and the dissolution of form. He ran his fingers over his wooden rosary, the smooth beads polished by years of devotion. The touch was familiar, grounding. He whispered a prayer, barely audible, not of plea, but of gratitude, for the fragile life of the boy, for Antoine's quiet courage, for the chance to serve rather than retreat. The repetition of the prayer, bead by bead, worked like balm on his spirit, a rhythm of calm against the storm. His mind returned to the metaphor of the manuscript. Thomas's life was a precious page he was trying to protect, and his care was the ink, the parchment, and the light. Prior Anselm, by contrast, was the worm, the dampness, the rot, the greed that gnawed at what was sacred in the name of false prophet. A quiet serenity spread through Elias's body, born from the acceptance of danger and the strength of conviction. The tension that had bound him for days loosened, replaced not by hope of a miraculous cure, but by faith in the quiet power of goodness, care, and observation. The belief that compassion itself could hold back the darkness, if only for a while. This contemplative pause became the summit of his inner peace, a moment when his moral clarity solidified, preparing him for the inevitable confrontation to come. His gaze lingered on the worn wooden crucifix beside Thomas's small hand, the image of suffering that had birthed redemption. As the sunlight faded into shadow, Elias noticed the faint scent of incense wafting in from the main corridor of the monastery. It was strong and resinous, meant to purify the air, but to him it carried another meaning, the smell of denial and hypocrisy, the perfume of fear disguised as faith, a veil meant to hide the truth rather than face it. Thomas coughed softly, a dry, frail sound that drew Elias's eyes open. The boy stirred beneath the blanket, his familiar motion of reaching for his thumb, slower now, wearier. The monk became suddenly aware of the warmth of his own skin, dry and tense, a mirrored fragility between healer and patient. Rising slowly, Elias felt the coarse wool of his robe brush against his legs as he moved toward the bed. He took Thomas's small hand into his own, the feverish heat pulsing weakly against his palm, the only proof that life still lingered there. Leaning close, he whispered a short, humble prayer, a plea not for miracles, but for endurance. What unsettled him most about Prior Anselm was not only the man's greed, but his cunning use of theology to sanctify cruelty. The prior had begun calling the abandonment of the sick a necessary sacrifice for the preservation of faith, twisting doctrine into a weapon, a dark, dangerous distortion of divine will. Elias realized then that the true struggle was not faith versus science, as many would believe. It was faith versus hypocrisy. It was the battle between sincerity and corruption, between compassion and the cold armor of dogma. Anselm represented the shadow side of belief, the human heart's capacity to wrap selfishness in the language of holiness. From beyond the infirmary, Elias caught the faint scent of food drifting through the halls, the monk's midday meal, simple bread and lentils. The aroma was humble, wholesome, alive, yet it seemed to mock the moral decay festering behind the monastery's stone walls. The contrast between the purity of that meal and the complexity of evil gnawed at him like hunger. He knew the pause was ending. Prior Anselm would return soon, and Elias had to be ready. The story of the prior's greed was no longer a rumor. It was his call to act. He couldn't allow the monastery to become both a tomb for compassion and a vault for the wealth of the dead. In his mind, his resolve took shape as a quiet image, a lighthouse standing against the night, a single flame defying the storm. His hope was not grand, but unshakable. That truth, if spoken with courage, could pierce the armor of fear and greed. Elias reached for the small scrap of parchment Antoine had left him, a rough map showing where the doctor kept his instruments in the village. The parchment was thin and fragile between his fingers, yet it held the weight of purpose. He knew he would soon have to venture out again, under the cover of night, to meet Antoine, and plan together how to bring the prior's deceit to light. The turning point was near. The monk could feel the heaviness of the choice pressing down on him. Preserve peace through silence, or defend truth through defiance. The answer, however, lay clearly before him, in the fevered eyes of the child resting nearby, a living emblem of innocence worth protecting. He looked toward the small window, where the sunlight had begun to slant, and the shadows of the iron bars stretched long across the stone floor. Darkness was coming, and with it, the hour of his next secret act. Night descended upon the monastery, with the slow, velvety grace of an autumn dusk. Darkness brought not only the chill of stone and air, but also a new clarity to Elias's mind. He was no longer just a healer or a monk, but a silent conspirator, an agent of quiet rebellion, moving through the shadows of his own cloistered world. The small candle he'd left burning beside Thomas cast long, ghost-like shapes on the walls, and the faint scent of melted wax and singed wick lingered in the air, a final, fragile connection to the boy he was leaving behind. He had dressed himself in his roughest, darkest garments, feeling the coarse wool scratch against his skin, as if reminding him of the gravity of his choice. Standing by the service door, he pressed his gloved hand against the cold iron bolt, feeling its bite seep into his palm. This time, his mission was different. It had grown from passive care to deliberate action, a transformation from monk to messenger. The weight of that responsibility pulsed like a restless warmth in his chest. When he finally opened the door, a gust of night air swept through the corridor, sharp, damp, alive. The scent of wet earth and brittle weeds drifted in, carrying with it the unmistakable truth that he was stepping out of order and into chaos, crossing the fragile boundary between safety and the sickened, untamed world beyond. Elias moved like a hunter, his senses sharpened, alert to every whisper and creak. The silence was immense, so complete that even the soft rustle of his robe seemed too loud. He listened for the tread of a patrolling monk or the echo of footsteps that didn't belong to his own, but there was only the quiet rhythm of the night, heavy and expectant. His mind turned to another figure, surely moving somewhere beyond those same shadows, Prior Anselm, who, under cover of darkness, would be looting the homes of plague victims in nearby villages. That image, Anselm's greed creeping through the same night Elias crossed for mercy, was a grim mirror, a moral contrast that deepened his resolve. The prior's hidden sins had become the engine of Elias's defiance, the dark heart of the plague he was determined to expose. He thought, too, about what it meant to walk into the night in the Middle Ages. Darkness was more than the absence of light. It was a realm of demons, ghosts, and unholy things. To leave one's dwelling after sunset was to invite the unknown. Yet Elias stepped forward anyway, defying not just his abbot, but an entire culture's fear of the dark. His courage was born not of recklessness, but of purpose. And that purpose now burned brighter than the single flame he had left behind. Elias made his way down the hill toward the village, the path now familiar beneath his feet. The chill of the damp earth pressed through the soles of his boots, but this time his mind was less on sickness and more on strategy, on finding the meeting point Antoine had marked on the small, weathered map. The night's cold bit at his skin, keeping him sharp, alert, a perfect counterbalance to the anxiety simmering inside him. The rendezvous was an abandoned forge at the edge of the village, a place that had once been alive with heat, smoke, and hammer blows, but now stood silent and cold. The air there smelled faintly of burnt coal and rusted iron. Once it had been a symbol of creation and labor. Now it was a monument to stillness, a reminder of how the plague had silenced not just voices, but entire crafts. Elias stepped into the yard, feeling the rough texture of the hard-packed dirt beneath his boots. His lantern threw long, warped shadows across the scattered relics of work, massive hammers, silent anvils, the gleam of metal dulled by dust and neglect. The quiet was so complete that he could hear his own breath echo softly between the walls. He paused and let his thoughts drift toward the memory of Balthazar, the blacksmith who had once owned this place, a large, strong man with calloused hands and a laugh that had filled the square. Balthazar had forged the monastery's tools with pride and precision until the plague claimed him just 3 weeks earlier. His death had left not only an empty forge, but an emptier world. To Elias, Balthazar had been the embodiment of honest labor and simple faith, the kind of man whose integrity held the community together. Remembering him now rekindled Elias's determination to unmask Prior Anselm's greed. The blacksmith had died so others might live, not so that the prior could plunder his home under the guise of quarantine. Then, from the darkness ahead, something shifted. A faint scrape of leather against stone. Elias froze, his hand instinctively tightening on the lantern's handle. From the shadows emerged the tall, familiar silhouette of Antoine, the plague doctor. His bird-like mask gleamed faintly in the dim light, and his long leather coat blended with the night itself. He looked more weary than before, his shoulders slightly bowed, his presence heavy with exhaustion. The sharp medicinal scent of camphor and vinegar surrounded him, a soldier's armor in the invisible war they both fought. "Monk," Antoine whispered, his deep, muffled voice cutting through the night without preamble. "The boy, how is he? Fever is the horse, but hope is its reins. Did the theriac ease him? I can smell fear on your robes, but also purpose." The doctor lifted his head slightly, sensing the cold air around them as if reading it for danger. Elias answered, his tone charged with quiet urgency, as he described Thomas's reaction and the small reduction of the buboes. He felt the relief woven into his own words, a soft counterpoint to the tension of the night. "He's fighting, Master. Your remedy gave him a chance. But I came for another reason. Prior Anselm. He's stealing from the dead, using quarantine as a mask for his greed." Antoine tilted his bird-like head, and Elias could feel the chill of those glass eyes fixed on him. "I knew it," the doctor said, his voice dry with resignation. "The plague is a mirror, monk. He's been gathering the finest things, jewels, silver coins, documents proving family wealth. But there's something even more curious about his greed, something that will give you proof." He stepped closer, and Elias caught the sharp, almost stinging scent of herbs wafting from the beak of the mask. "Anselm hides his treasure inside the monastery itself, in a place no one else dares to go, not even the abbot. It's a dry well beneath the planks of the bell tower loft. A place rough and dark to the touch, like the texture of a secret. That was the revelation, the vital piece, the location of the prior's hidden hoard." Elias realized he didn't need to confront him directly, only expose him. The tangled intrigue of the monastery had reached its quiet climax in the image of an empty well filled with stolen treasure. "He believes the place is sanctified by the silence of the bells," Antoine continued, a trace of irony curling through his words. "But that silence is his confession. The bell that doesn't ring tolls for his guilt, and that, monk, is your opportunity. Anselm's fear of contagion is weaker than his hunger for gold." Elias felt a wave of determination rise through him, steadying his breath, warming his chest. His fear had given way to purpose, to a fierce, clear hope of restoring moral order within the monastery walls. His struggle was no longer abstract. It had a face, a direction, and a light. He thanked the doctor quietly, feeling the coarse wool of his habit against his skin as a reminder of his vow, and promised to act the following night when the prior would be out again, looting in the dark. They parted with a simple nod. Two unlikely allies, a man of faith and a man of science, bound together by their defiance of human corruption. As Elias climbed the hill back to the monastery, the night air stung his face, crisp and bracing. He carried with him the knowledge that could expose the plague's truest darkness, not the disease itself, but the loss of compassion and the rise of greed in its place. That awareness, that fragile hope, was his weapon against despair. When he returned to the infirmary, the familiar scent of wax and herbs welcomed him. Thomas lay sleeping more peacefully now, his small chest rising and falling with gentle rhythm. Elias stood beside the bed for a long moment, watching him breathe. The boy was proof that goodness still lived, that kindness could outlast fear, and the monk knew with quiet certainty that his next act would save more than a child's life. It would save the soul of the monastery. Elias spent the following day in the infirmary in a state of tense, watchful calm. The warm, heavy air of the room seemed to hum with the urgency of his approaching mission as he administered the last of the theriac to Thomas and watched the boy's fevered body with near-sacred focus. Every sense was heightened. He was aware of every sound, every scent, every texture, as if trying to memorize the peace of this fragile refuge before stepping once more into the darkness of intrigue. He could hear the soft, rhythmic pattern of his own breathing blending with the boy's, a quiet duet of life in the midst of silence. The strong aroma of chamomile and honey felt more vivid than ever, an invisible shield against fear. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the small cane he used to stir Thomas's straw bedding, and for a brief moment his thoughts drifted to the bell tower, the dry stone well hidden beneath its floorboards, the rough, dark texture of Prior Anselm's secret. A fragment of monastic life surfaced in his mind, the rule of silence, the silentium. In the monastery, it was a discipline of humility. Now, it was a tactic for survival. Monks were trained to communicate with discreet gestures, a silent language born of devotion. Elias found himself living that same silence, not as a spiritual exercise, but as a necessity, where the faintest sound could betray him, and only the covert understanding between him and Antoine offered any safety. He waited for the soft, distant toll that announced Compline, the last prayer of the night, the boundary between the world of whispers and that of pure silence. That would be his signal, the sacred moment when the monastery itself seemed to hold its breath. The silence of the bells, once a symbol of desolation, had become his ally. A hollow space he would fill with purpose. The smell of melting wax thickened in the air as the candle on the table neared its end, its flame trembling in the dense stillness. Elias felt his heartbeat rise, not with fear, but with steady anticipation. Somewhere above him, the tower waited. He imagined the musty scent of its stones, the odor of old dust and forgotten secrets, an aroma not of plague, but of spiritual decay. What he was about to uncover would not be the stench of death, but of corruption. When Compline ended and the last dragging footsteps of the monks faded into silence, the monastery was swallowed by a stillness so absolute it seemed to hum in his ears. The only sounds left were the faint sigh of the wind brushing against the roof tiles and the careful rhythm of his own breathing. Elias felt the cold of the night seep into the infirmary, a silent summons to act. He checked on Thomas one last time, placing his hand gently on the boy's forehead. The skin was cooler now, less damp, a fragile counterpoint to despair. The buboes had softened, and the child slept more deeply than before. Elias left a single candle burning beside the bed and slipped out, closing the door behind him with the weightless precision of a feather. He moved through the shadows of the cloister like a man who knew every stone, every echo of its ancient geometry. The chill of the flagstones pressed through his leather sandals. His fingertips brushed the smooth curves of the columns as his figure blended into the dark. a monk transformed into a ghost. Every sense was tuned to the edge of perception. He heard the soft rustle of his robe, the steady pulse of his heart, and the faint lingering scent of forgotten incense and cold wax in the main corridor, the fragrance of routine abandoned. Elias began to climb the spiral staircase leading to the bell tower, feeling the rough wear of the steps beneath his feet. Each movement was deliberate, each breath measured to avoid even the faintest creak of wood or echo of sound against the stone. The higher he climbed, the tighter the tension coiled in his chest. At the top, the air was sharper, thinner. Before him stood a small wooden door, locked with an ancient padlock, the entrance to the tower loft. He touched the cold iron, recalling Antoine's words. The prior fears contagion more than thieves. From the folds of his habit, Elias drew out a small iron tool, his narrative climax in the middle of stillness. It was a crude master key, fashioned for old and rusted locks. He slid it into the keyhole, feeling the rough resistance of the corroded metal, and then came the sound, a dry, delicate click, the quiet announcement of revelation. The monk pushed the door open and stepped into the loft. The air that met him was thick with the scent of ancient dust and dry timber, but beneath it lingered something stranger, the sweet, heavy tang of metal, the smell of wealth locked away too long. It was a scent of greed made physical, a cloying contrast to the poverty and sickness he had left behind in the village below. The chill of avarice filled the air. The attic was dark, lit only by the faint glow of his lantern. The old wood creaked beneath his sandals, each sound sharp as a cry in the silence, forcing him to stop and listen. Before him stood the great bronze bells, silent and veiled in dust, vast shapes that loomed like mute witnesses to both tragedy and betrayal. He moved carefully, brushing against thick frayed ropes that hung from the ceiling. The rough fibers scratched his fingertips as he advanced toward the center of the loft, where loose boards revealed a small circular opening, a dry well, the mouth of the secret. Elias raised his lantern and shone it into the dark. The beam of light cut through the gloom and revealed what lay hidden, the hoard of Prior Anselm. A chaotic heap of stolen goods, leather pouches heavy with silver and gold coins, jeweled rings, gilded chalices, and most damning of all, stacks of sealed documents and wills, the written evidence of greed, of manipulation, of lives exploited for profit. Each object told a human story, a silver wedding band, a worn pocket Bible, a small locket engraved with the Virgin's image. Every item was a fragment of love, faith, and loss, now desecrated, reduced to treasure by the prior's hands. Elias felt a surge of heat rise within him, anger, righteousness, and resolve. His pulse steadied into certainty. This was the proof he needed, the irrefutable evidence to shatter the hypocrisy that had corroded the monastery's soul. He reached down and retrieved one sealed will and a small pouch of silver coins, feeling their cold, heavy weight press into his palm. The smell of old parchment and tarnished metal filled his senses. These were not relics of faith, but relics of sin, the material embodiment of the plague's darkest truth, that the real contagion was moral. Moving as silently as he had come, Elias left the attic, closing the wooden door and locking it again. The click of the metal was faint, almost reverent. As he descended the spiral stair, the hush of the monastery no longer felt oppressive. It was the sound of his impending victory, the pause before justice was spoken aloud. Back in the infirmary, the familiar air embraced him, the mingled scents of herbs and warm breath. Thomas slept peacefully, his fever broken, his color returning. The boy's fragile recovery mirrored the redemption Elias hoped to bring to the monastery itself. He hid the evidence beneath his straw mattress, feeling the rough texture of the bedding beneath his hands. Tomorrow, at dawn, he would face the abbot with the truth. Night had unveiled the secret. Morning would deliver the reckoning. Elias sat down on his wooden stool, eyes fixed on the trembling flame of a single candle. Its light wavered but held, defying the dark around it. In that flicker, he saw the reflection of his own act, a quiet defiance that had saved more than a child's life. It had preserved the last remnant of purity within the monastery's walls. Dawn entered the infirmary with deliberate slowness, its pale light filtering through the seams of the wool curtains, gently reshaping the air of the room, turning the night's dim half-light into a cold, grey morning, an omen of the change Elias was about to set in motion. The monk breathed in the mingled scents of cold wax, fading theriac, and chamomile, an aroma of a battle fought, and for the moment, won. He sat on his wooden stool, feeling the coarse grain beneath his fingers, the stolen will and pouch of silver coins hidden beneath his straw mattress, a cold, tangible weight that was both his proof and his weapon. The faint pressure of the parchment under the straw was the only physical reminder of what he had done in the night, and he waited now for the exact moment to act. The atmosphere carried that peculiar stillness before upheaval, a surface calm that hid the storm inside his chest, the quiet tension of an impending confrontation balancing the fragile hope of moral restoration. The cold of the morning no longer frightened him. It felt instead like a stage being set for truth. Thomas stirred softly, a low whimper escaping his lips. Elias rose and went to him, resting his hand on the boy's forehead. The temperature was nearly normal now, a steady, human warmth that felt like divine reassurance, the perfect counterpoint to the moral decay he was preparing to expose. The gentle touch on the child's skin grounded his resolve. It reminded him why he must act. A thought surfaced, one that deepened the gravity of his mission. In medieval life, wills were not mere legal instruments, they were covenants for the soul. Men and women left possessions to the church in exchange for prayers, for the promise of salvation. By stealing those documents, Prior Anselm had not only robbed families of wealth, he had robbed the dead of their eternal peace. It was not theft, it was desecration. Elias drew a slow, steady breath, the chill air tightening his lungs. His conviction had crystallized into something unshakable. Anselm's greed was not just sin, it was the denial of compassion itself, the negation of the sacred duty that had once defined their brotherhood. And now, Elias knew, obedience was no longer virtue, truth was. The moment came just after prime, when Abbot Theophilus would usually retreat to his cell for a brief time of meditation before beginning the duties of the day, a window when his mind was more open to reflection and less bound by the rigidity of rule. It was a narrow passage of grace, and Elias knew he could not let it close. He left the infirmary with steady steps, the rough wool of his habit brushing against his skin, the hidden parchment and pouch of coins pressed inside his sleeve. His heart beat fast, like the muted toll of a bell, yet his breath and his voice remained calm and measured. He found the abbot in his simple cell, seated on a plain wooden chair, the faint morning light streaming in through the small window. The smell of fresh incense still lingered, a fragrance of devotion that made the air feel almost sacred. Elias bowed deeply, his voice clear but restrained. "Reverend Abbot," he began, feeling the cold edge of the parchment beneath his palm, "forgive my boldness. I come to confess not only an act of disobedience, but a truth that threatens the very soul of this monastery and your own holiness. Prior Anselm does not fear the plague, Father. He profits from it." Theophilus looked up, his face weary, his tone calm yet edged with authority. "Speak, novice. Your charity toward the orphan has already tested my patience and the order of this house. Do not add slander to your sins. Fear makes us see demons where there are none, Elias." But Elias did not falter. He withdrew the evidence and placed it upon the small wooden table, the will and the pouch of coins landing with a dull, resonant sound. The soft thud of parchment, the faint ring of metal, simple sounds that carried the weight of revelation. "This is not the work of fear, Father," he said quietly, "but of greed." Then he told the story behind the objects, the will of a farmer who had left his modest estate to the church in exchange for prayers for his soul, an act of faith desecrated by the prior's theft. The weight of the metal and the solemnity of the document spoke more powerfully than words could. The abbot took the parchment with trembling hands. The texture of the fine vellum under his fingertips seemed to burn. His eyes moved across the page, and when he reached the name, recognition struck him. A loyal parishioner, a soul he had personally blessed. The stern mask of doubt fell away, replaced by shock, by grief, by the heavy collapse of certainty. It was the quiet climax of confrontation, the moment when truth pierced through the veil of obedience, and silence itself seemed to hold its breath. The silence inside the abbot's cell was dense, a living thing. It pressed against the stone walls, filled only by the slow, unsteady breath of the old man. The morning light, once cold and distant, now fell harshly upon the wooden table, illuminating the naked truth before them. The abbot's fingers brushed over the silver coins. Their chill was the chill of betrayal. He looked at Elias, his eyes heavy, not with anger, but with sorrow, a deep, exhausted grief that belonged to a man who had believed too much in order and too little in compassion. "Where did you find this, novice? And why would Prior Anselm do such a thing? The plague must have broken his mind. He swore vows of poverty and obedience. This is a perversion of both, a desecration." Elias told him of the dry well beneath the belfry, the hidden hoard, the greed buried in silence. As he spoke, the rhythm of his words mirrored the rhythm of the secret itself, the well, the concealment, the corruption. Each repetition deepened the weight of truth, and Elias felt for the first time the lightness of duty fulfilled, the triumph of hope over fear. The abbot rose slowly, the coarse wool of his robe rasping against his hands. His once straight posture bent slightly under the weight of revelation. He realized with painful clarity that the quarantine he had enforced, the rule meant to protect his brothers, had become a cloak for evil. His fear of the plague had blinded him to the contagion within the walls. He turned toward the small window. Sunlight had begun to touch the stones of the courtyard, warm and indifferent. "You have done what I should have done, Elias," he said quietly. "You saw charity where I saw danger. You saw truth where I clung to law. The darkest face of the plague indeed is not death, but the loss of our humanity, and the prior is its proof." Without revealing the nature of the sin, Theophilus summoned 2 elder monks, men of unwavering loyalty, and sent them to the bell tower. "Seal the well," he ordered. "Leave it as it is, untouched. No word of this leaves these walls." The abbot sought to preserve the monastery from scandal, yet he knew that the seed of truth had already been planted, and it would grow in silence. Elias felt a wave of warmth rise through him, a moral clarity brighter than the morning sun. He had faced fear and greed and prevailed. His disobedience had become his purest obedience. The soul of the monastery, for now, was safe. The abbot regarded him with new eyes, eyes that no longer saw a reckless novice, but a man of conviction. "Return to your orphan, Elias," he said softly. "You are our only hope now. Your mercy is stronger than my rule, and pray for us, that fear does not make us forget who we are." Elias left the cell, the chill of the corridor brushing his skin, though his body was warm with purpose. The confrontation was over. Truth had spoken. His hope stood as an active counterpoint to the dread that still haunted the monastery's air. Back in the infirmary, the familiar scent of herbs greeted him. Thomas slept deeply, his small body steady and calm. Elias sat on his wooden stool once more, the silence now gentle, no longer the silence of fear but of relief. Let that peace linger. Greed has been unmasked, and compassion has prevailed. Elias and Thomas are safe for now. But beyond the monastery walls, the Black Death still moves, and the world waits for its next act in the shadow of faith and fear. Stillness settled over the monastery after the quiet departure of Prior Anselm. He had been escorted away without ceremony, under the pretext of an urgent mission, his secret buried between the abbot and the elder monks. Yet his absence lingered, like the scent of something foul that had finally been removed. A shadow dispelled, but not forgotten. In the infirmary, Elias felt the atmosphere shift into a state of solemn calm, the hush that follows a small but meaningful victory. Now he could give his full attention to the fragile rhythm of Thomas's recovery. In the days that followed, his care became a ritual of gentleness. He felt the boy's skin cool beneath his touch, the harsh, fevered heat fading, replaced by the clean scent of linen and dried herbs, a sensory testimony stronger than any word. Elias whispered quiet repetitions of prayer and comfort, phrases soft as lullabies, meant to soothe both his own heart and the child's fragile sleep. The rhythm of care became his meditation. During his rare moments of rest, his thoughts drifted in subtle recollection, revisiting the fragments of his ordeal. The chill of the monastery gate on that first forbidden night, the leathery brush of Antoine's plague mask, the cold weight of the stolen testament in his sleeve. These flashes of memory did not haunt him, they anchored him, proof that courage and compassion could coexist within the same soul. Thomas's recovery stood as the living counterpoint to the darkness outside. Beyond the monastery walls, Elias knew the plague still crept through the silent village, invisible and patient. Yet here, in this small room of warmth and breath, life was winning, quietly, stubbornly. Watching the boy sleep, Elias saw the faint flush of returning color on his cheeks, the flutter of calm beneath his eyelids. It was a fragile flame, but it burned against the wind of death. That image was his shield, his prayer made flesh. A passing thought brushed his mind, a small but revealing detail of medieval life, the worth of shoes and boots. They were costly, treasured, signs of dignity and survival. He remembered how Anselm's spotless boots had gleamed as he was led away, in stark contrast to the bare, muddy feet of the villagers he had exploited. That simple observation, a matter of leather and earth, felt like a final judgment. Greed had clean boots, compassion had calloused feet. And for the first time, Elias allowed himself to rest, not in ignorance of the plague that still raged beyond the walls, but in quiet faith that even amidst decay, goodness could still take root and breathe. The faint scent of incense lingered in the air, an aroma the abbot had ordered to be burned in the main chapel. This time, it no longer carried the hollow ring of pretense. Without the prior's shadow looming, it smelled almost sincere, a fragile fragrance of purification and hope. The abbot was quietly trying to restore order and sanity within the monastery, and though no one said it aloud, Elias had become the quiet heart of that renewal. But peace, he knew, was only ever an interlude. It ended with the dawn. A new sound broke the still rhythm of morning prayers, a dry, rasping cough that echoed through the cloister like a tolling bell. It came from Brother Peter, one of the oldest monks, a man known for his strength and easy laughter. The sound of his cough carried more than illness, it carried dread. Elias froze, the warmth of the infirmary still clinging to his skin as a chill of alarm swept upward through him. The plague had breached their walls, not through the orphan's frail body, as the fearful had once imagined, but by its own inexorable will. Stone could not stop the invisible. The monastery, once a fortress of order, had become its next battlefield. And in that moment, Elias realized fear had returned, not as an intruder from outside, but as something reborn within their own hearts. His mind swirled in a quiet storm. Brother Peter's sickness was more than the loss of one good man. It was proof that Elias's earlier victory over greed had only been a prelude. The true test had arrived. He had saved the monastery's soul from corruption. Now he would have to fight for its life. Peter was not just another monk. He was kindness in human form, one of the few who still smiled at Elias in the cloister, who had left extra bread by the infirmary door during the long nights of fear. His illness struck Elias like a personal wound. The monk's small human story, his generosity, his laughter, was being swallowed by the same darkness that had taken so many others. Elias left the infirmary, making sure Thomas slept safely, and hurried through the cold corridor. His sandals met the chill of the stone floor. His breath came out in small white clouds. The mingled scents of incense and sickness reached him before he even entered Peter's cell, one the odor of faith, the other of death. It was a cruel blend, thought Elias as he paused at the threshold, the smell of heaven and hell meeting in the same narrow space. Elias found Brother Peter trembling in his cell, his skin hot and dry to the touch, the telltale purple swellings already rising harshly along his neck. Yet there was no fear in Elias, only a deep, quiet sorrow and a renewed sense of duty. Moments later, Abbot Theophilus appeared. His face was pale, his eyes hollow with weary resignation, and the faint smell of sickness clung to the air around him. When he spoke, his voice was thin, trembling on the edge of despair. "The plague is among us, Elias. What are we to do? I have failed them all. My rule has been useless." Elias, once a novice, now stood as guide. The warmth of conviction replaced the tremor of fear. "We will not run, Father Abbot. We will do as Antoine taught us, air, isolation and hope. We will care for him, we will love him. That is our only rule now, our only shield." The abbot bowed his head, surrendering without protest. His authority dissolved into humility. "Then lead us, Elias," he whispered. And so the novice, with a handful of younger monks, lifted Peter from his straw bed and carried him toward the infirmary. Their movement through the silent halls was the living opposite of fear, an act of courage born from compassion. In the infirmary, Elias helped settle Peter onto a clean bed. The coarse wool of his habit brushed against the fevered skin of the dying man as he mixed herbs into hot water, the same humble remedy he had once used for Thomas. This was not just Antoine's crude medicine, he thought, but the truer science of mercy. He glanced from Peter, whose breath came ragged and shallow, to Thomas, sleeping peacefully nearby, the image of life returning. One boy recovering, one man fading. Between them stood Elias, the fragile bridge of care holding back the flood of despair, and in that stillness the meaning of it all became clear. The plague was not punishment, but trial, the measure of what remained human in them. He knew the end was drawing close, not the end of the disease, but his own strength. The faint ache in his limbs, the burning at the back of his throat, whispered the truth he would not name. Perhaps he too was marked, but it no longer mattered. His purpose was complete, to love, to serve, to endure. The smell of the plague was stronger now, sharper, more metallic than before. It filled the air like a warning bell. Elias sat down on his wooden stool, the surface rough beneath his hands, and drew a fresh sheet of parchment toward him. His pulse was steady, his mind clear. By the fire's soft crackle and the uneven rhythm of two breaths, one healing, one failing, he began to write his final confession. Each stroke of the quill was gentle, deliberate, filled with peace. His story was nearing its end, not in despair, but in quiet completion, a closing act of devotion written in ink, faith, and silence. Elias sat at the small wooden table in the infirmary as the faint light of dawn filtered through the curtains, mingling with the dying flame of a candle. He began to write his final confession, a quiet testament, his last gift to the world, an epilogue to his brief and fervent resistance. His quill, once used to copy sacred texts, now moved slowly across the parchment in deliberate, steady strokes. The soft scratch of the nib against vellum was the only sound breaking the solemn stillness of that chamber of healing. The air was thick with contrasts, the heavy, sweet scent of death rising from Brother Peter's fevered body beside him, and the fresh, faintly herbal breath of life from little Thomas, sleeping peacefully on the other bed. Beneath his bare feet, Elias felt the chill of the stone floor. Within him, the growing warmth of fever, a quiet messenger that his own time was drawing near. Yet his mind was calm, his heart at rest. He did not begin with lament or prayer, but with remembrance, revisiting that first night he stepped beyond the monastery walls. The cold iron of the gate, the slick mud of the village road, the strange, stoic silhouette of Antoine, the plague doctor, those images returned now, completing the circle. His ending was his beginning, proof that his death was not defeat, but the fulfillment of a purpose born in darkness. Elias understood then that a life spent among books and silence had found its true meaning only when he dared to touch the misery of the world, to feel the texture of fever, the weight of injustice, the pulse of fragile hope. He wrote that the truest monastic vow was not isolation, but participation, to walk into suffering, not away from it. The plague, cruel as it was, had been the world's harsh teacher of compassion. He paused for a moment, feeling the soft tip of the quill between his fingers, and turned toward Thomas. The boy stirred in his sleep and smiled faintly, an unconscious gesture of healing. That small, radiant smile was his story's redemption, the proof that kindness could outlive both contagion and cruelty. And in that fleeting image, Elias found his final peace, his last, quiet hope. Elias continued writing, his sentences long and flowing, like a slow river finding its way to the sea. He recounted the betrayal of Prior Anselm and his desecration of the dead, greed draped in the robes of faith. Yet his revelation was not merely about the crime itself, but about the deeper sickness that had allowed it, fear. He shaped a quiet metaphor to describe the prior, writing that the Black Death was not a fire that burned, but a flood that stripped the earth from beneath their feet, exposing what had always been buried and rotten. The greed of the human heart, he wrote, was like cold moss clinging to the shaded stones of the bell tower, slow, persistent, thriving in darkness. Elias wrote of contrast, of Anselm's moral decay beside the flawed humanity of Antoine, the plague doctor. Though Antoine believed in miasmas and snake remedies, he had risked his life for the sake of care and observation. A pagan, yes, but one who had shown a monk the true shape of mercy. His confession turned into reflection, a message for the brothers who might one day read it. The Church, he wrote, would not survive by the rigidity of its rule or the hoarding of gold, but by the fragile strength of compassion, the one force the plague could neither infect nor steal. He described the gentle warmth of Thomas's small hand resting in his, the fever receding, the breath growing calm. The weight of the stolen testament, once cold and damning, was now replaced by the delicate weight of a life returning. He felt his own body growing lighter, as though the burden of his mission had finally lifted. And at last, Elias reached his final revelation, the moral climax of his testament. He wrote with the certainty of a martyr of kindness. The true horror was never in the swelling or the fever, which were the work of nature. It was in what the plague revealed about us. The darkest loss was not of life, but of compassion. Disease took the body, fear took the soul, and the only true miracle was the refusal to abandon one another. He closed the parchment, feeling the coarse texture beneath his trembling fingers, and turned his gaze to Brother Peter, who had stopped coughing. His breath was faint, nearly gone. Elias understood that silence. It was the sound of completion. His final act of charity had been fulfilled. He had not let a man die alone. The quill lingered in his hand for a moment longer, trembling slightly above the parchment, as if unwilling to rest. Ink still glistened on the page, black and alive, like veins carrying the last pulse of his devotion. Elias let out a soft breath, watching the faint curl of air rise and vanish in the cold light. He felt for the first time the strange stillness that follows a truth fully spoken. He looked around the infirmary, the quiet beds, the flicker of a candle barely holding its flame, the shadows stretching across the stone walls. Everything seemed to exist between worlds, half in light, half in darkness. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, saturated with meaning, with the faint echo of prayers whispered and lives touched. Beyond the narrow window, dawn was only a rumor. The sky wore the color of ash and faint silver, and the sound of wind, moving through the distant bell tower, drifted faintly down, a hollow reminder of the silence that had once symbolized fear. Now, that silence felt sacred, like a space cleansed by courage. Elias rested his hand over the parchment as if blessing it. He thought of the countless hands that had turned holy pages before him, scribes, healers, and monks who had copied words without ever truly living them. His ink, however, carried not borrowed wisdom, but lived truth. He had written not for glory, but for remembrance. He thought of Antoine, the weight of his strange leather mask, the glint of his glass eyes in the lantern light, the faint scent of vinegar that always clung to him. In the doctor's persistence, Elias had glimpsed a new kind of faith, one born not of ritual, but of relentless care. Perhaps, he thought, we worship the same thing, only through different prayers. Thomas stirred softly in his bed, a small sound that pierced the quiet. Elias turned his head and watched the boy's chest rise and fall, steady and calm. The rhythm of that breath was more comforting than any hymn. It was proof that even in a world undone by plague, life could still insist on being beautiful. He dipped the quill once more into the ink, not to write, but to let it rest there, its tip submerged, its purpose complete. He no longer needed words. His silence was enough. The act of writing had not only recorded truth, it had purified it, like confession through ink. A soft tremor ran through his body, but he didn't resist it. The fever was no longer an enemy, but a messenger of peace. His skin burned faintly, yet inside he felt cool and weightless, as though his spirit had already begun its slow ascent toward the realm of forgiveness. The candle beside him flickered once, twice, then steadied, its flame a quiet witness. In its glow, Elias saw the reflection of everything he had tried to preserve: dignity, compassion, and the stubborn hope that humanity would outlast its own fear. Even if his body failed, his story would remain, breathing through parchment and memory. He smiled faintly. The world outside the monastery would go on, villages would rebuild, bells would ring again, and children like Thomas would learn to laugh without trembling. His only prayer was that somewhere in that future, kindness would still find a way to speak louder than silence. And so, with that thought resting gently in his heart, the monk's final act of charity was complete. He had not let a man die alone, nor allowed the truth to vanish in the dark. Elias felt his fever rise, a soft, almost comforting warmth, as he lay back on his narrow bench, eyes fixed on the dark wooden ceiling of the infirmary, where the shadows seemed to drift in rhythm with his slowing breath. His vision blurred, But his mind was clear, sharper than it had ever been. He thought of Abbot Theophilus, who now carried both the truth and the chance to restore the monastery's dignity. The abbot would understand at last that true worth did not lie in the silent bells or the illuminated manuscripts, but in the spirit of sacrifice he had witnessed in Elias and Antoine, the final contrast between dogma and love. Peace settled over Elias like a warm veil. His body was surrendering, but there was no fear, only fulfillment. He had kept his vow, not of seclusion, but of humanity. The heat that coursed through him was no longer the fire of illness, but the gentle glow of a purpose complete, a farewell written in warmth. He closed his eyes, and the last sound he heard was the soft sigh of Thomas, the steady breath of a child who had been saved. That quiet exhale was his final comfort, his redemption. His story had ended, but for the orphan, life was just beginning. Now let this image settle in your mind. Brother Elias at rest, the orphan Thomas sleeping peacefully beside him, and the sealed parchment bearing the truth about the plague's darkest side, its denial of light. The silence of the infirmary is now the silence of peace. And in this stillness that now surrounds you, traveler, with your body heavy and your mind light, you realize that stories never truly end. They simply pass from one set of hands to another. From a weary monk to a child who will remember the touch of kindness in the night. Your thoughts begin to drift at the edge of sleep. This parchment of truth and mercy left behind by Brother Elias is our reminder that even in the darkest of ages, the choice to be compassionate remains our only true weapon against fear and indifference. And that choice, that small, flickering flame, is what makes us human. Until tomorrow, I'll be here waiting to travel again with you through forgotten eras, through moments of quiet courage and unexpected humanity. You already know where to find me, right here, waiting, between history and dream. Sleep well, traveler. Peace be with you.